Bruce, I've got 4 questions that I've been asked to ask by other legal representatives and 6 questions I've been asked by your legal representatives. And I'm going to ask all of them. I think they might, to some extent, call on you as that expert patient or patient expert in some regards. I'm going to deal with those questions that have been suggested by others first and then turn to some questions that your legal representatives have asked that I explore with you. You told us this morning about what your parents were told about the risks of hepatitis. You might get a touch of hepatitis, implication being it would be mild.
Yes.
And transient.
Yeah.
What's your belief as to why doctors told patients in circumstances similar to that which you've described your parents being told, that hepatitis would be short-term, mild, given everything else that you've pointed to that was known about hepatitis at the time?
Compliance. My father would not have let that needle touch my skin. He would have fought cat and dog. He'd have gone to the press. He'd complained to his MP. I'm a father myself. I know, he's long past now, unfortunately, but I know my dad, I know my mother up to an extent has suffered quite significantly with making the decisions that injured me, but I've never held them responsible. I think by using very disarming terms, like touch off, slight, you minimise it deliberately in language. And you've got a kid there, you've got to understand it. I mean, as a parent, you're going into the hospital with a kid that's in agony, right? I can remember points where it felt like there was nothing left to do but scream. So totally from that perspective, the pressure my parents are under is make my child better, take the pain away from them. Now, the truth is, the factor didn't take the pain away from me. The pethidine took the pain away from me. That's what stopped me crying. And even though they were giving me factor 9 from the late 60s, my recoveries were still quite slow. And I know from being an adult during the HIV era where I refused to take treatment, that there isn't much of a difference between having taken factor other than the first 3 or 4 days. It still takes about a week, 10 days to recover from something pretty major, but just that first bit, that's the bit that factor makes a difference in. But without it, you're just elongating it a little while longer, you're having to take more rest. I mean, I play a game with myself when I do my prophylaxis now. How many things can you do when you're carrying prophylaxis? It's deliberate. I know the stuff I'm sticking in my veins is dangerous. I have to distract myself from it mentally. But I know that, and I know I'm cheating myself. But I think those doctors were cheating my mum and dad, everybody's mum and dad, and everybody who was an adult that consented to this treatment. The language was deliberately designed to minimise any threat that the parents thought was coming from the treatment. And I think that's particularly notable in Factor 8, where you really did have a standout alternative, which had good clotting efficacy, generally, and tended to work better, and certainly with von Willebrand's tended to work better. But you want them to go into this experiment. You want them to be part of that. And to use minimising terms, you gain compliance.
And in relation to Factor 8, that alternative you're talking about is cryoprecipitate.
Cryoprecipitate, yeah.
The second question, and I don't know whether this is something that you have been involved with or thought about during your research or campaigning, and it's about the position of female haemophiliacs who've been infected. Do you have any views on whether the position of women haemophiliacs has been overlooked or sidelined?
Not deliberately, but yes. I mean, an awful lot of blokes, very few women. We tended to overshadow them. But in fact, that became a function of who came forward as well. I mean, it was mainly blokes you saw in the news. It was mainly, haemophilia is dominantly a male condition, but we understand. I mean, I've known a large number of female affected and severe female affected through going to various haemophilia centres as I travelled around. And yeah, I think it's not deliberately sexist. And I think that at the end of this inquiry, I would hope that this inquiry has given significant consideration to the unique position it puts women in reproductively, risks in relation to sexual transfer because of monthly periods, what extra problems they might have. But I also think that we've underestimated the role or understated the role of our carers as male haemophiliacs who tend to be women, who tend to have given up jobs, lost pension rights, who have provided care frequently to the point of decimating their own health, damaging, destroying their own health. I don't think we've done enough for any of those groups yet. We tried in Scotland a bit. The reason for the widow's payment was the recognition. I remember making the arguments to the civil servants at the time was, you do know that women disproportionately are carrying the long-term burden. We go and die. We get out of this. They're left with the poverty, the funeral, the hardship, and the memories. They carry the burden into their lives. So, yeah, I think that the women's role, in general, whether it be an affected individual or a carer, has been totally underrepresented in campaign terms and needs to be fully addressed before this process is over.
Third question goes back to the Second World War. And again, I don't know whether this is an area that you have investigated and researched at all, but in the course of your researches, did you come across or learn anything about any involvement in that period by the pharmaceutical company Bayer?
Yes, there was a bit we weren't allowed. We had one line cut from the play. It was based on a series of interviews by Auschwitz-Birkenau survivors from the twins experiments, Mengele. And in it detailed a woman talking about her sister's death so she was she was taken by Mengele. She was given something that was toxic that caused an infective result. She recovered from it. They took plasma from her and they injected it into her sister. This is Bayer. Bayer caused, the Germans didn't build a concentration camp and then put a pharmaceutical factory in it. Bayer asked them to build a concentration camp round their factory. So they're directly testing the immune system, immunoresponses, therapeutic plasma. It's a very rude and, as it turned out, fatal experiment in that the young woman died. So it was clear to me that they were trying to understand how they could develop immunity in another subject. And they figured that because twins, you would have blood matching, genetic matching, you would have low barriers in relation to other factors in stopping this from working as a process. It fails to understand how immune systems learn and how we become differentiated, even if we're genetically the same, by environment, by contact, by various other adjutants. And when we saw that, we figured that'll be our in. That's how we can but it scared the hell out of the lawyers for the theatre company, so it was left out. So yes, I've seen Bayer in documents doing stuff, but the main culprits are the American military. They had their own vaccine system that became the CDC. The Rockefeller Institute, which is also Abbott's, who have made a small fortune out of us over the years, Hep B testing, HIV testing, various other things. They're a lot closer to home. There's an awful lot of stuff the British government's gained from us. So, yes, Bayer, and yes, I've seen stuff that dates to the Second World War, but I've also seen stuff from the American military that dates between the wars, the British military that dates between the wars, French experiments, Pasteur Institute relates to the French military. I've seen all of that stuff as well. So the idea that it's focused on one drug company, I think is erroneous.
The fourth question is really just to ask what, if anything, you've come across looking at relative infection rates with HIV, those with haemophilia A and those with haemophilia B.
Yeah.
Use the word relative for obvious reasons because you've told us the much smaller numbers of people with haemophilia B. But I've been asked to ask you, is there anything that you have come across or any observational take that you have about the relative rates of infection with HIV?
Well, I have a major problem with all the HIV data. I think that the timelines are all bullshit. There's no other term for it. It's just that they don't make sense. They're too pat. They don't work out. Every time you test them, there's always that problem with them that just doesn't quite work. In Factor 9 and in Factor 8, we lost an awful lot of haemophiliacs before they started counting us. So the data that everybody talks about, the 1,275, 72, whatever number it is, it's probably missing 300 or 400 that died between 78 and 84 inevitably. If you look at the exposure periods, there must have been deaths in those periods of time. Now, whether or not they were put down as pneumonic or hepatitis or whatever. So if you're asking me for a fixed number, there is Factor 9 cases. There are NHS Factor 9 HIV cases. What's odd about them is that there isn't as many as you would expect because there's so few of us. There was less batches. And if there was less batches, that means that one infected batch theoretically could have taken out a larger percentage of us than it did in Factor 8. So, I mean, what was it? Factor 8, it's 1 in 4, that was 1 in 3, 1 in 4 that were actively treated in the 80s that became infected. With Factor 9, it's not so clear. And I've never been able to get proper hard data. And I think part of the reason I can't get hard data on it is the majority of the HIV cases would have been NHS. And they don't fit that American narrative that was being popularly pressed, not just by certain campaigners who I hope forgive me for this, but by certain politicians who might have had an interest in directing us away from NHS blood supplies. So I don't trust any of the data. That's my best answer to that.
I'm now going to turn to some questions that those representing you, Bruce, have asked me to ask. And the first really follows on to some extent from something you've just said. What, if anything, did your research work lead you to conclude about the relative safety of Scottish products for those receiving pooled products compared to those imported from abroad?
They're exactly the same. There is no difference. I mean, numerologically, so I mean, if you're talking about incidences, etc., by the time you get to a plasma pool of 5,000 even, you statistically must have so much Hep B in it, so much Hep C in it, and ultimately so much HIV in it. We have HIV cases created on the NHS. If we'd gone over to large-scale production NHS, no American, we'd just had more homegrown HIV cases because to get that blood, to make those products, we were going into prisons, we were going into military bases, we were going into these wrong places. I mean, I've asked people to define for me what the hell is Skid Row. Right, what is Skid Row? I mean, it's an American term. It's used to describe what? Poverty, people living on the breadline, high-density housing. And then, of course, my answer to that is, well, okay, so what's Skid Row's Skid Row? It's prison. High density, poor people, poor health, all in one place. All drinking from cups. I was told by people that served time in prison at the time, all drinking from cups that were chipped, unsanitary conditions, pooing and peeing in buckets, slopping out. Transmission of disease in prisons extremely high. That's Skid Row. So we would have used more of that blood. We would have gone more into prisons. We would have gone more into the military because that's the only place we had to go. Unless they'd spent a fortune, not on the factories. They had to spend a fortune on the factories as well, but just on the actual collection of plasma. We didn't have enough blood fans. We didn't even have enough freezer space. As is clear from the Medicines Inspectorate, BPL and PFC, there was not enough storage. Comes up time and time again. So the fundamentals of actually upscaling, I think we would have resulted in a product that was at least as dirty as the Yanks. It's a case of, as I said earlier on, when you get into these arguments, it's really a case of like, what coal mine was the canary down? The canary's still screwed. It's going to die. But American, British, relative risk, the risk profile's the same.
Is this right to understand your perspective then, that it's not so much the geographical source of the donation, it's the unsafe donation practices wherever they're taking place, and the question of pool sizes?
Yes, it's pool threshold, because you're playing with probability then, and it is donor selection. And without those donor selection, without, say, excluding military personnel as they knew pre-1960, and without avoiding American bases that were full of experimental vaccine subjects, you were never going to make that stuff safe. This was only ever going to be a coal mine, and the question is only ever really, which coal mine are you going down?
The next question, different issue, hepatitis C. What's your view on the suggestion that hepatitis C transmitted to someone such as yourself can be cured?
So, cure is a relative term in medicine, but for the rest of us out there, cure means better, right? It means, you cure my leg, I can run again. You cure my lungs, I can breathe again. So, I don't think we've been cured. Our relative risk to cancer, time has shown, has not changed much. The average life expectancy of haemophiliac, I certainly know from the Scottish data, only 1 in 4 of us gets to be 65. It's like we fall off a cliff at 60. So, yeah, I mean...
You touched on the next question I'm going to ask you earlier. It's about the issue of recombinant products.
Yes.
And what harms you understand continue to exist in recombinant products. You've given us some literature on it. I'm not going to go to that, but can I ask you in your answer to distinguish if you think there is a distinction between early recombinant and modern recombinant?
There's a significant change between the stage 1 recombinant and the stage 2 recombinant. There are still risks, right? So can I separate them in my answer? So the first stage recombinant has got albumin in it as a stabilizer, human albumin. That presents human pathogen risk. And there was P5, parvovirus 5, parvovirus 19, TT virus, which is rodent, which probably came through in the cell line. And this is where we get a problem when we talk about recombinants. So this is why I agree with Professor Hahn, who gave evidence to this inquiry. We haven't closed the door on zootypes at all in relation to recombinant DNA products. Yes, we're gaining greater surety because we're cloning pure cell lines, but it's very hard to spot fragments or partial RNA viruses, particularly those non-heat sensitive herpes viruses that are insidious and cause all kinds of weird and horrible things to happen to people in the long term. We're still getting through. We've still got not just a theoretical risk. I mean, you write to those drug companies, and you write to the companies that are making the drugs, they'll actually tell you. I had a look at the latest leaflet from my Factor 9, and it even says potential zootype risk on the leaflet. As I say, without monitoring us throughout lifetime, you have no surety, you've got no data. And this whole, I mean, I still think it's hilarious that they said, oh, we had normal life expectancy in 1980 from having, we're only lived till we're 20. What a ridiculous idea. Where's your longitudinal data to prove that? 1 in 4 of us was dead by the end of the 1990s. So you're still insisting that we had no, come on. It's like, be credible. At least make an argument. You hoped we might, but you had no data to say we would. It's wishful thinking at best.
My last 3 questions are in relation to campaigning. And the first is one I'm going to ask in general terms rather than deal with any specific single aspect of campaigning. To what extent overall have you felt that Scottish politicians, both pre and post-devolution, have listened to Scottish campaigns?
As a general point, pre-devolution, we got very little response. I got very tired of going and seeing gammony men, and I mean gammony men, in their 50s and 60s who would tell me things like, you're in a queue of causes, son, and Hillsborough's going to be first, or that awful massacre, those kids, and all of those things came up, and these Gamini men, oh, no, it's like you guys are at the back of the queue here. So all the time we were living on benefits, bugger all, and surviving, barely surviving. And I'm going to see these people, and I'm going to see a number of Scottish politicians over the years. And then we get to devolution, and a very unique change in devolution, a very important change in devolution, I think, in relation to this campaign, was the committee system. And one of our earlier campaigners, Mr. Philip Dolan, made a very important move, and that was with the support of a few of us on the outside. He put forward a petition on our behalf into the Petitions Committee that was accepted in the Health Committee. We developed relationships with the Health Committee to the point where I still can speak as friends to a number of the politicians that were on that or still serving politicians. And it allowed us to have a dialogue that, and we never get in Westminster. Westminster doesn't talk to us. They don't want to know what shit we're in. They just want to know how much they're going to get off with. They spend their time trying to work out how to get out of things. The Scottish Parliament seems to spend its time working out how to fix things, but they haven't got much money, so you kind of have to get creative. But at least there's collaboration. There is discussions. I can get to see a minister. I've frequently annoyed Bill Wright at various events by the Haemophilia Society because I can go, well, when Shona was health minister, Shona, can I have 5 minutes? She'd go, no, you can have 10. And I would get to speak to Nicola and have very straight chats to the First Minister still to this day. She knows bluntly where I'm coming from. Yeah, I think it's Westminster's bill, but the Scotland Act says it's yours. So somebody's paying for this. But we have a responsive politic in Scotland. We have the ability to have politicians that will listen to us. We can feed things in. We can finesse things. We have evolved the system within the current support schemes. I hope we can evolve it further. There is greater need that's unmet, but there's a degree of collaboration. They listen to us. The civil servants listen to us. We have very good civil servants within the scheme. They will feed things back. You can't say to them, look, do you know what, if you did this, it might be a bit easier, and you can make change. It's slow. I wish it was faster.
The 2016 Scottish Financial Review, what principles were insisted on as part of that process?
Nobody should ever be worse off. So wherever somebody was within the schemes as they existed at that point in time should not be worse off, number one. Number two, the right to be average. Right? I don't regard myself as average, but I think a basic aspiration should be the right to have an average income, an average expectation, an average house, an average family. So the right to be average salary, that's where it came from. So we tried to set our sort of datum payment on that right to be average. And I finally, because so many of us are dead, and because during those negotiations in 2016, I was speaking to men who did not make it to the point where this ended, was to assure those men, no, your widow's going to be looked after, mate. Don't care what happens. We are making sure your missus ain't getting kicked out of this house. We are going to fight on that. And one of my oldest friends, who will remain nameless, I will hug his niece shortly in a few days' time, but he cried down the phone to me days before, thanking me and Bill for the work that we'd done to make sure that his missus was all right. And I totally get that. It's like it's bad enough the damage that we've done in our lives by being sick in a household, the chaos, the mental health, all the trouble that comes, all that time in hospital, all that heartache you give your family. You can't help but feel responsible for it. But the thought of actually leaving them impoverished at the arse end of it, barely able to stick you in the ground, that tore us apart. All I really care about is making sure that my family's all right. I'm not actually that concerned about myself. I don't think any of us really are. We're more concerned about the people we love and the impact that our lives have had on them, and trying to make good on that as best we can.
Last question, still in relation to the financial review. What was the position and attitude of Christine, your wife, about you being involved in the financial review?
Context it. although I knew that Nicola Sturgeon was about to read out the Scottish Parliament, that she was going to do something, I hadn't been ready for the emotional reaction. It was really guttural. I started shaking as she was announcing, no, we're going to do something. But Christine had been through cancer. She was bald from chemotherapy. She had a lumpectomy, which hadn't gone well. I have gripes about the surgery because it got infected. It's not her fault, it's the surgeon. But I really felt like I owed her, right? I owed her me and my time. So I said to her, I can't do this. I need to be with you. You're going through radiotherapy next. And she insisted. She turned around to me and said, look, you need to do this. Not only because you personally need to do it for yourself, but because you will have an effect on this process that's positive. And I need you to go and do that. And without her consent, without her telling me, you know, I mean, I'd watched my wife get to the point of near death. Watching somebody going through chemo, it's horrific. No idea what it's like to go through it, but she was the same colour of the sheets one day when I got in the car and I drove down to Edinburgh. She looked like she was in a shroud. She looked like she was dying. She had no hair. She was the same colour as the bedclothes. And I kissed her, didn't want to wake her up, got in a car, drove to Edinburgh to have another argument for a whole day with the civil service about things that I thought were fundamental and should have been sorted out ages ago. So, yeah, she told me I could do it. It's probably the hardest bit of what we had to do. She ended up taking herself to radio appointments when she shouldn't have had to. But I wouldn't have done it without her consent.
So those are the questions I've been asked to ask Bruce. I know Bruce has some things he wants to say at the end. Do you first, sir, have any questions for him?
No, I don't. Thank you very much.
Bruce, what would you like to add?
I've written a few words over 30 years. I've had some thoughts about how things should go. So, the three things that have kept me campaigning: my friends, the scandal, and hope. My friends, it is our story I've tried to tell. I built the case initially, as we all did, on chats, noting not only the incongruous elements in our experiences, but the incredible similarities which showed the coordination of events from centre to centre. The lack of honesty with patients and parents about risks, about infections, the lack of responsibility and the attempts to avoid the reality of what was to happen by doctors and state. This is what brought us together. Friendships grew from tragedy. I remember when I last saw my friend Hayden Lewis, over a decade ago now. We had just descended en masse to Westminster, as we did. For yet another debate. He was 2 weeks from death. Bald, chemotherapy, thin, yellow, his voice was weak as thread. I remember saying, what the fuck are you doing here, mate? I cuddled him. I gently hugged what was a frail body. He said, I'm here to break the law. It's illegal to die in Westminster. The scandal. We build the language commonly used by all. Scandal is Hayden's. He used to say that it was important to focus on those things. The worst disaster in the history of the NHS. I'm sorry, Lord Winston, it was me that put those words into your mouth. Infected and affected was me, because we were finding it hard to describe the broader impacts. We now take for granted those words. We inherited the label campaigners, but I want... Oh God, this is out of sequence now. We were, and those of us that still are, patients with questions. Nothing more, nothing less. The reasoned request of damned souls. We were forced by scandal to fight just to exist, forced to go to law, forced to become researchers, lobbyists, interview subjects, to declare our illness publicly in life with no good choices, just stark realities of fold or fight. Our campaign was built on decades of research and activity that once allowed me to pick up my phone book and ring a list of numbers to check my work. Now, in common with the few that are left of those true long-term battlers, I carry the weight of the lost. All those promises I made to dying comrades and friends, and that we'd carry on, and we did, and we do. So as I frequently do have to ask, what is my task now? To ensure I truly honour the fallen, those ghosts of friends, those irretractable promises that I would see the fight through to the end. Hope. I have hope for this inquiry. First, there is a need for appropriate memorials. I feel that the inquiry's report must be crowned by the unveiling of memorials in each of the UK's capital cities in a place of prominence, supported by governments willing to acknowledge responsibility for, in the most traditional way, a formal recognition of apology to those whom they did not give justice to in life. Secondly, there is a need for support. We must ensure that those who are left are supported in the most complete way possible to enable them to take full control of their lives and make the best they can of what they have left in the most complete terms. Families of the living and the dead have been made victims too by the state's treatment of their loved ones. As things stand, the state bears the responsibility to make good the damages and losses, and no one should be worse off at the end of decent compensation process. But ultimately, how do we make sense of such death and suffering on an industrial scale? Well, thirdly, there needs for recognition, in my view, that can only come from significant change in how we understand the concept of pioneers within medicine. And that needs to change to the patient being the pioneer. It is only the patient and his loved ones that will truly suffer medical failure. This must be recognised. All new medicines must have compensation rights automatically written into them. Any trials should automatically be insured. Funds should be established to make sure those responsible for medical products, be they the state or commercial entities, can be held liable and will have the money for all losses created, without having to plunder medical budgets or decimate other people's lives in return. It should not be a trade-off. Fourthly, there needs to be honest incentives for honest disclosure of adverse events from the individual practitioner whose mistakes should be learnt from, but also disclosed in order to inform teaching and the practices of others, to drug companies who may need more punitive encouragement. We need a system where doctors can declare their mistakes. Maybe it will cost them retraining, limitations in their practice, but honestly should not be seen primarily as a threat to end a career, but as a means to improve and inform practice across the profession. Dishonesty can only, and certainly has, immeasurably compound harms caused in such events. Fifthly, we need to protect the children. In the long-term conditions like haemophilia, the child must be enabled thoroughly by being offered the broadest possible support, from genetic assessment beyond the headline conditions. The dramatic haemophilia, frequently they miss the autism, the heart disease, the other things. Child development must be a feature. Stronger nursing positions must be a feature. Physio, occupational therapy, psychological support, social work, educational input tailored to the needs of each child so that the medical burden is answered with possibility of empowerment. Finally, I want to end by offering this most public of apology to my wife and children. No family should ever see their husband or father dig a trench in the front living room and go to war with the state. But I have hope of a ladder from my trench to mental peace. I can only hope you understand. I had to stand for those who fell or are falling, my comrades, my friends, my blood brothers, my sisters. I commend my work to the inquiry and hope it continues to be to the fullest understanding. I hope it contributes to the fullest understanding of the simplest of questions. What were haemophiliacs for? Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Sir Brian.
Some things which I have to thank you for, I think, are obvious. First of all, you've come from Scotland here to give evidence in person when you could have sought to give it remotely. And I think that's just part of your campaigning style. But you've given it despite, as came out in the evidence, you're suffering pain, and you told us you're very not well.
Yeah.
So that, I think, deserves particular recognition on its own. But more than that, you call yourself a lobbyist, perhaps, given your remarks at the end, a reluctant one, but felt obliged to be so. And you've given us, as a lobbyist, what I've taken from it is a very clear plea for looking at the whole picture, looking at everything holistically, taking starting off with a broad view of history and setting what happened in the 70s and 80s in a much broader historical context, in seeing systems, in seeing links, in seeing people with haemophilia as not, or with infection, not as being isolated, but as people who have families, who have contacts, who have lives to live, who may infect others as a result, whose illness cannot be confined within the envelope of HCV because there are co-infections, there are other infections, so on. You've made a plea for clinicians not to operate as silos, but to take a holistic view of medicine and to take a broad view of science, to look broadly at all viruses. And at the very end, again, I think your plea for breadth in everything has come about by the way you've been able to speak of the recognition that you look for those who have suffered in all ways, in all of the home nations. And I just want to thank you for that. You've made those points in very much your own style, but I won't forget them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So
Tomorrow,
we are hearing from 3 witnesses who will be giving evidence as part of a panel. Simon Hamilton, Lynn Kelly and Bill Wright. And the latter 2 will be present in person. Simon will be attending remotely from Northern Ireland.
so we'll have 2 people on a screen.
Yes.
Tomorrow. I don't mean any insult to Simon as a result. Very well. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.